You all awake? Good. Final home stretch. Here we go. Okay, we've covered a lot today. And I'm aware that for a lot of you this is new. You're trying to process and still connect the dots. I want to encourage you to go home and start looking online. There's a lot of good stuff available. There's a lot of very simple talks on YouTube about theology of the body. There's a lot of really good books that you can get. And there is then this whole rabbit hole you can go down, where people really start to drill into specific areas of this and how this works and what the implications are. Hopefully this is just kind of stirring up a hunger in you. In this final part, we now bring back to earth, okay? We started at the beginning in creation, we then went to heaven, and we're now coming back to here, okay? So how do we understand marriage here on earth? Wanted to start this section, because this is really where we're taking this vision of what marriage is meant to be, but also that awareness of how broken the human heart is. And we're trying to work out how do we now bring these two realities together. So, aware of what that sin is within us, how do we now try to come to make your marriage into the reality of what it could be? Just want to start with an image I came across. I was listening to a talk by a woman called Louise Perry. She wrote a book recently called, I think it was called Why the Sexual Revolution Failed Women. And I don't think she was actually a Christian. I don't think she's come from a Christian background, which is kind of what makes it particularly interesting. And she's just looked purely at the research. What has actually happened? What has this revolution done? And she's very clear saying women lost. If anything, it was a grand conspiracy by men to get what they wanted. Trying to convince women that this would set them free, but in the end they won. Just this image she uses. And it was just in my head it made a lot of sense. She kind of uses this idea of a bell curve. And she says, if you think of this as being sexual desire, so within a certain population of men, there is going to be a whole spectrum of how people experience sexual desire. Okay, so if you think of that blue bell curve as being men, some are way on the extreme. Okay, others, very little desire. The vast majority in the middle. Okay? So she kind of says, okay, if you look at men and women, there's the same bell curve, but they're different. Okay, female sexual desire is actually probably quite a whole lot lower than male sexual desire. Now, the whole idea is, if you look at the modern sexual revolution, what it's basically said is that women need to catch up with men. And women need to start acting more like men. So they need to be more promiscuous, more out there in their behaviour, and basically do whatever they can to keep up with what men are desiring. And this is why we're seeing such a rise in sexual violence, because men are expecting this, but also why there's such a huge rise in depression amongst women, because they're not actually wanting that. Okay? But this is what the whole media culture is saying, that for you to be free as a woman, you need to be more like a man. The interesting thing that this woman says, Louise Perry, she basically says that there was actually an original sexual revolution. So the sexual revolution that we normally refer to was in the 1960s, but the first sexual revolution was in the 1st century, and it was caused by the Christians. And the original sexual revolution was the opposite. It basically said men need to match women. And this is where the whole idea of chastity was so revolutionary. I think it was in her talk, she talked about how within the Roman Empire, there was something like 37 different names for prostitution. Like prostitution was regarded as just the norm. Okay. Female virginity was highly prized, but there was no word in the Roman Empire for male virginity. Just did not exist. Like, the expectation was that men could do whatever they wanted with whoever they wanted. Okay? And so Christianity comes along and basically says, okay, within the culture, there is already this expectation that women should be chaste until they're married. We're saying that's good. It now applies to men as well. And this was revolutionary. That the church now talks about celibacy for both men and women. Okay? And the interesting thing, with a lot of the scriptures that we read, we actually kind of miss the point here. Yeah, because we read the scriptures through the context of the modern sexual revolution. And we look at the scriptures, we're like, oh, this is saying all these things about what women should do, and that's unfair. But we actually miss the point that it's actually the other way around. In that Roman culture, it was expected that women would be submissive. It was expected that women would be chaste. The fact that Paul is throwing in this thing, actually the men should be the same, that was like dropping a massive bomb in the middle of the culture. And that's what changed society. Now, that's just kind of a preliminary to where we're going here. Because I think it just kind of sets the scene for what this vision is actually trying to achieve in the modern world. Okay, that in that battle that plays out in the human heart, there is actually something here for men particularly, that they have to step up into this battle. It's universal, but there is something that we're acknowledging very particularly here. Now, where the Pope goes to in this section is he begins with a famous passage from the letter to the Ephesians. Now, this passage is famous for the reactions that it gets. Every time I've ever been asked to do this reading at a wedding, people say, can we leave certain lines out? Because I know that family members are going to get really annoyed. Let's just read through it, and then we're just going to break this open. Okay. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Saviour. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. After all, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed and care for their body, just as Christ does the church. For we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united with his wife, and the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm talking about Christ and the church. However, each one of you must love his wife as he loves himself, and the wife must respect her husband. Okay. Now, let's just kind of go back to where we started. So, the obvious reaction that always happens is this idea that wives should submit to their husbands and obey them. Any women here suddenly finding their blood pressure rising? Okay. This passage makes no sense at all if we are reading it through the lens of the fallen world. And the problem is that this is the way this passage is normally read. Okay? That suddenly this now becomes the battleground. You know, that same battleground that came on that fateful day in the Garden of Eden. You know, this is where wives are saying, I'm not going to submit to you. And husbands are like, Jesus said so, okay? You have to do what I said. I'm the head. You're the body. Okay? And suddenly that battle, that manipulation, that warfare continues. And so for us to actually go through this, we all need to take a deep breath and say, okay, we are already being redeemed by Christ. We're looking at this through a very different reality. Okay. And so we begin in this first line, submit to one another out of reverence to Christ. So what the Pope's trying to say here, okay, if we want to understand what is marriage here on earth, we have this position of mutual submission. Okay? Now, Paul's not saying, wives, submit to your husbands, and husbands, do whatever you want. That's what the Roman Empire was doing. Okay, that was the culture of the time, and sadly, it has still been the culture of our church for a long time. Okay, our cultures have not actually been redeemed. What Paul is saying is, submit to one another, mutual submission. Now, this next part is kind of really interesting. So, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as you do to the Lord. Now, the translation you get here is always going to be a bit different. This idea of submission, to understand the word itself is important. Okay? So, sub means under. Yeah? So, come under the mission of your husband. Okay? So it's not necessarily do what you're told. Okay? It's not like be the doormat. Paul's not saying do whatever he asks you to do around the house. Come under the mission of your husband. Now that then raises a big question. What is the mission of your husband? Okay? So, if we go down, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water and through the word. So you've got this beautiful image saying, okay, if you want to understand what is the mission of the husband, understand what is the mission of Christ in relationship to the church. Christ is called to lay his life down to make her beautiful. So Christ loves the church, gives himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, to present her to himself as a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. So Christ's mission is to die, to give everything, every last drop of blood, so that his bride, the church, becomes beautiful. We're clear on that? Okay. And so, husbands, your mission is to love your wife in that way. That's your mission. Okay? So, wives, your job is to come under that mission. We now kind of have an interesting circle going on here. And it changes the story completely. This is no longer about domination and power. It's actually the invert. It's a completely inverted picture. It's about laying your life down. Who can lay their life down more for each other? And this is actually really key to St. Paul's vision. There's a line in Philippians. If I find it. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul's talking to the community, and he's basically saying, like, outdo one another in giving honor. So normally, he's saying, in normal society, there's a competition about who can gain the most honor. You walk into a room and subconsciously you're trying to show off that your job's better than everybody else's job. Okay, my car's better than your car. My kids are better than your kids. You all know you do it. Okay, like everyone does this. Paul's trying to say, because of what Christ has done, the whole world's been flipped on its head. We are now no longer trying to fill the emptiness by gaining honor ourselves, but rather we outdo one another in giving honor. So Christian parties should be a place where everyone's like, you're amazing. No, you're amazing. No, you're even more amazing than I am. That's how it's meant to be. And marriage is meant to be the fulfillment of that. It's like, I'm going to lay my life down for you more than you can lay your life down for me. I'm going to sacrifice myself more than you sacrifice yourself. Could you imagine if your marriage was that sort of competition? Rather than like, well, I did the washing up last week, so you've got to do it this week. Like it's like, well, I've given more to this marriage than you've given. That's the culture we're in. Whereas this is like, I'm desperately trying to outdo you in laying my life down. If that was what marriage looked like, marriages would look more like heaven. They'd also look a lot more like the cross, okay? Because you would very, very intentionally be waking up every day saying, that's where we're going. Now, it's kind of interesting, this is just a side tangent. I was doing a talk a few years ago to some of the young adults about marriage, and I was just contrasting images of marriage vows compared to religious vows. That, weddings, it's all beautiful and it's wonderful and it's light and we're going to live happily ever after and it's all about us and the flowers and the photos. But then religious vows, you've got someone prostrate before the altar in the form of a cross. And it's just interesting that they know exactly what they're getting in for. We're here to die. In fact, in some religious orders, part of the ceremony of making your vows was they actually covered you with the funeral pall, the same sheet they would actually put over the coffin. It's kind of a way of saying, like, you're dead. You've sacrificed everything for Christ. There's nothing left. Now, marriage is actually meant to be the same thing. Okay? An altar is a place where you sacrifice something in worship towards God. The reason why you come and celebrate your marriage in front of an altar, symbolically, it's because you're saying our life is a sacrifice. It's not about us. It's not about living happily ever after. It's about living holy ever after. Okay, it's like I'm going to give everything. I'm not going to leave anything at all for myself. And that's where it becomes a covenant. A contract is where I'll give you this if you give me that. A covenant is where I give you myself and you give me yourself in return. And the more I give, the more I receive. The goal is that at the end of the marriage, there's nothing left of me because I've given everything. And there's nothing left of you for you to have either because you've given everything you are to me. That's what it's meant to be, this constant mutual exchange. And so this is what JP2 is trying to draw out. So when he's talking about this idea that in this passage, Paul is talking about, he's talking primarily about Christ and the church. If we can understand this mystery, if you can understand what the cross means, that this is what marriage looks like. I remember saying that once in a talk, and this woman just laughed and said, "Yeah, that's what my marriage looks like." I didn't want to ask any more questions. But don't think of it in terms of the pain and the suffering. Think of it in terms of the gift. Christ willingly went to the cross to give himself for us. You know, this is the mystery. This is what love looks like. And so Paul is here now saying, okay, the same thing is for the husband and the wife. And in some sense, the husband has to lead this. You know, I think one of the great tragedies of our church is that the men are absent. You know, like in our church demographics, it's 60-40. You know, and the men who are here, I think, are here just because they're trying to submit and obey. Okay. But if the husband doesn't understand the mystery of the cross, how can he lead that circle of self-giving? You know, he has to understand what Christ's sacrifice meant so that he can now embody that sacrifice in pouring out love for the other. And it's only when he is leading that the wife is safe enough to respond. If he is not leading that, then it becomes domination. You know, this has to be mutual. It cannot just be one way. So this is the great mystery we've got to enter into here. So hopefully this is at least getting you thinking, like trying to connect the dots of everything we've talked about today. This is, I think, the place where our vision of marriage here on earth suddenly changes dramatically. That it's no longer about meeting my needs, it's about how do I pour myself out. And the more I pour myself out, my needs are actually going to be fulfilled as a result. Just want to jump to the next part here. So from this point, JP2 jumps into two other areas. Really, I suppose, trying to bring all of this background into a practical reality. What he does here is he talks about this idea of the language of the body. So we've talked about how the body is holy, the body has meaning, so that this idea of the nuptial meaning of the body, that the body exists to be united with another, and in doing so it communicates something. This bit is kind of simple, but really quite profound. So what the Pope is trying to say here is that actions speak louder than words. Maybe the simplest thing we could say here. Okay, so in a wedding, a couple will stand up the front here, and in front of all their family and friends, they profess their wedding vows. Okay, I take you for the rest of my life. I give my whole being to you. It's a spoken, lifelong vow. Now, these days, no one thinks that vows are actually important, but vows are extremely important. Okay, a vow is not something to be done lightly. You know, I've got a friend who talks about the fact that, you know, in the world of business, to break a contract is a really serious thing, and there's massive penalties to break a contract. Whereas marriage, whatever, who cares? Okay, there's no fault, there's no punishment at all. It's actually meant to be the other way around. It's this reality that in forming that covenant, you are giving your very soul to the other person. Okay, it can't be taken back. Marriage is indissoluble, it's for life. And so that those words you speak are powerful. They change reality. Now, what the Pope is trying to explain here is that the spoken word then gets communicated in a bodily way. So as the marriage is consummated, your body speaks the vows. You're saying, this is my body given for you. I'm sure you've heard those words before, yeah, in the Mass, okay, because the Mass is a marriage. But this is the whole point, okay? It's like, this doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to you. It's yours. Okay, I give everything, and I can't take it back. And so this is the whole idea. This is the language of the body. Now, this is where the Pope is then trying to explain a few of the connections here. So if we want to understand, okay, the absolute sanctity of marriage is that the body needs to speak truth. Okay? So if you've got a situation where your body is saying something, but your mouth is saying something different, there's a problem. And so this is the scenario, like say with people hooking up before marriage. Your body is saying, I'm yours forever. But your words are saying, this is just for tonight. And so it becomes the most profound lie you can ever speak to a person. And this is not just a verbal lie. This is a lie at the very level of your soul. And so this is where, in terms of, I suppose, trying to connect this theology into the church's teaching, you know, why does the church have such an issue around premarital sex? You know, it's not because it's just some moral teaching that was created by a bunch of stuffy old celibates in the Vatican. It's because, as the Pope's trying to describe, like the body communicates something. And once that's communicated, it can't be taken back. And this is the tragedy that, you know, people say, oh, but we love each other. Yeah, but you're loving each other. You're loving each other enough to lie to each other consistently, and you know, in the deepest, most painful way possible. That's not love. Okay. And so this is where we need to say, okay, this is why the sacrament of marriage becomes so important. Because it's only when we actually recognize the seriousness of that vow that I give myself to the other for life. And I stand before the whole community to say, you're witnesses to this. You've got to hold me accountable to this. This is not just like some contract I can break when I'm bored. This is for life. And to recognize that every time you are then united bodily, you are renewing that covenant. Your body is communicating again, I'm yours, completely given. So this now becomes really key to an understanding of why this morality is so important. Just want to make sure you're kind of connecting the dots within your mind, and we can keep going forward. Now, this is the final stretch. Okay, we've got 15 minutes. The reason why this becomes so important is in everything that Pope John Paul II was doing here. He was trying to lay a foundation to help us understand how to navigate the modern world. So, as we said at the beginning, he was a bishop at the time when the sexual revolution exploded. And he saw the devastation that was happening around the world. He was working very closely with young couples, a lot of young married couples who are very, very close in his youth ministry. And he was very aware of the struggles they were going through. He wrote a famous play called The Jeweler's Shop. If any of you like literature, look it up. And it's a very real sort of dramatization of how couples were navigating these issues. In the midst of this, the world suddenly was faced with these big moral questions around life and love. So obviously central to this whole idea of the sexual revolution was the invention of the pill. That there had been forms of contraception around for decades, but suddenly you had this chemical contraceptive which seemed to be the liberation of humanity. And this raised massive questions. A lot of the other Christian churches were already wrestling over whether, this was right or wrong. Many of them had said, look, we can't see a problem with it at all. And so it became this now battleground, really, where everyone looked at the Pope and said, well, what do the Catholics think? This looks like it's going to set the world free. It's going to be amazing for married couples because there's such pressure around fertility and, trying not to fall pregnant at the wrong times, and this might just solve all the problems. And so Pope Paul VI basically said, look, we need to discern this carefully. And so what he did was he invited experts from every field. There was theologians, there was doctors, there were philosophers, there were people who were very much advocates for the sexual revolution. He basically said, look, I want to hear from everybody here. And basically try to get an idea of where do they think the church should go in terms of this issue around contraception. Now, famously, what happened was there was 2 reports that came back. What was known as the majority report said, we think there's no problem with contraception at all. We think the church should accept it. There was a very small minority group who said, bad idea, don't go there. And the Pope looked at this and he said, I'm going to go with the minority group. Now this suddenly exploded for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because all the information got leaked to the press about, prior to the time. And it suddenly became this big claim that, well, the Pope wasn't listening to the majority, and almost this idea that somehow morality should be determined by democracy. If most people think it's okay, then it should be okay. Where the Pope was actually coming from was really saying, okay, this is not about who has the most numbers, okay? Because he was inviting atheists onto these panels, people who had no understanding of Christian theology at all. So of course they were going to be leaning on a particular way. But the Pope came back to this and he said, fundamentally, we need to understand what it is to be human. We need to understand this grand mystery of life and love. And he releases this document called Humana Vitae. Now, like most church documents around sexuality, no one reads them. They just flick through and say, where's the bit that says what we want to hear? Doesn't say what we want to hear, throw it away. Most people have never read Humana Vitae. All they know is that it said contraception was bad. When Pope John Paul II created this theology of the body, in reality, what he was trying to do was explain Humana Vitae. He was trying to say, okay, what you got was the rule which said no contraception. I'm now trying to explain to you the worldview which makes sense of that. Okay? So, right at the end of all of this teaching, JP2 says, okay, let's talk about Humana Vitae. Okay? That there was something that Pope Paul VI presented which was prophetic. Okay? It was this profound truth that maybe he even didn't understand the full weight of it. But JP2 is now trying to unpack. Now, to try and very simply bring this together in light of everything we've said. What Paul VI was trying to reveal here is that there's this beautiful image in the Old Testament where it talks about the commandments. And it actually says the commandments are your inheritance. Have you ever thought about the 10 Commandments as being your inheritance? Or do you think of them as being your burden? It's like, oh, I'm not allowed to murder anyone today. I would really like to. For the Jewish people, they would dance with the scrolls of the Torah because they're like, this is our gift from God. This is our inheritance. No other nation has been given a law as good as our law. And Paul VI was trying to say, you've got to look at this moral teaching in the same way. This whole teaching around life and love is your inheritance. You were not made to chase after the screwed up piece of paper that we had earlier in the day. The world is selling that to you in this massively pornography-focused world, saying, just treat each other like animals. And yet here's the Pope saying, no, there is this bigger, beautiful vision where you are meant to live out of that desire, out of that yearning for something more. And that is where you're actually going to find the fulfillment you're looking for. Yes, it is difficult, okay? Becoming an adult's difficult. Living life is difficult. But it's your inheritance. So this is kind of the background where he's saying. Now, fundamentally, what the Pope's trying to say here is that this whole idea of this love within marriage is that you have been given permission to kind of play God. You get to create human beings, okay? Married couples, I don't know whether you ever stop to think how profound that is. Sometimes, I don't know whether sometimes we think that souls already exist in heaven and they're just looking for a body. That's not Catholic teaching, okay? That was condemned centuries ago. If, the child you have given birth to would never have existed had you not given birth to them. Their souls would never have come into existence without you. That is mind-blowing. You've created someone who's going to live for all of eternity. And I think this is what the Pope's trying to say. You've got to realize that's huge. And with that responsibility comes certain responsibilities. You've got to respect the power that's been given to you. And so this is where we sort of recognize, okay, like, there is this union between life and love. Love creates life. And life cannot thrive without love. These two things always come together. The problem of what happened around the time of the sexual revolution was we tried to radically split these two things. So the whole thing of the contraceptive mentality was saying we want love without life, because life gets in the way. Life stops us from being selfish. I've got dreams and plans. I don't want kids. I want to spend my money on ski trips to Austria. I don't want to have to be buying kids' clothes and school books. And it sounds crazy, but that's where the advertising goes. I don't know if you've ever seen adverts for contraceptives, but they literally saying. I saw an article talking about. It was advertising. I think it was contraceptives in Europe, and it was basically this choice of a children's dummy or the red high heel shoes. Which one do you want? But that's as stark as the advertising is. It's like we've got the solution, so you get what you want. You don't want a kid. But then the crazy other side is that now that we have split that, we also want life without love. So originally we wanted love without life, but now we can play God and create life without love. And so you've now got companies advertising, saying to young women, okay, you haven't found the man of your dreams, doesn't stop you from having a child. We can make that happen for you. And so IVF now becomes the solution to that. There was an article just the other day in the Vatican News, some new research showing that since the beginning of IVF, there's been about 17 million children born as a result of IVF. They estimate there's been 270 million children die as a result of IVF. All the embryos that are created and then discarded. How do you equate that? Yeah, that's enormous. I'm not great at maths, but that's like 18 for every one child. But this is where this, like the sexual revolution wasn't just simply about the fact that we wanted to have more sex and more porn. It's the fact that we've ruptured the very core of what it is to be human. And this is what Paul VI was really trying to call us back to. He was saying we're playing with fire and we're going to get very, very, very seriously burnt. Now, in his original document, he had three things which were, well, this is sort of the four prophecies of Humana Vitae. An increase in marital infidelity, a general lowering of moral standards, loss of respect for women, and then coercive government intervention in citizens' reproductive lives. When he said this, people laughed and said, that's never going to happen. Yet, 50 years later, he's... Oh, yes. Yeah, so we're actually now seeing, like in the next 20 years, there are certain countries that won't exist. Like South Korea is going to collapse as a country economically. The birth rate in Seoul is 0.5, whereas it needs to be 2.1. So, yeah, in our lifetime, you're going to see countries literally fall apart. Just to break this open, so he says, responsible men can become more deeply convinced of the truth of the doctrine laid down by the church on this issue if they reflect on the consequences of methods and plans for artificial birth control. Let them first consider how easily this course of action could open wide the way to marital infidelity and a general lowering of moral standards. A man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman and disregard her physical and emotional equilibrium, reduce her to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, no longer considering her as his partner whom he should surround with care and affection. And he goes on, careful consideration should be given to the danger of this power passing into the hands of public authorities who care little for the precepts of the moral law. They should regard this as necessary. They may even impose their use on everyone. All three of these have become fully reality. I've even heard stories here of Indigenous girls going in for, minor surgeries and having contraceptives implanted in them without even their approval at all. This is where, coming back to JP2, fundamentally he's trying to say, look, we need to create a revolution. In some sense, it's a Christian revolution trying to fight against a very destructive revolution. When this began back in the 1960s, there was a lot of hope. There was a lot of great ideas that this was going to liberate the world. And yet here we are, 80 years later. And we're talking about the fact that certain countries may not exist in 20 years. We're talking about the fact that, the rates of sexual abuse amongst women have skyrocketed because you've got generations of young men who are being formed by pornography. Child abuse as well. So the vision that JP2 is presenting here is not just a nice little spiritual idea, but rather this is something which, as a church, we need to be presenting to the whole world. The starting point, I think, is for yourselves to actually really absorb this vision. Particularly that idea of what Paul presents in Ephesians chapter 5, that mutual submission, laying your life down. If you can come to a place where you start to really understand what that looks like in your own marriage, in your own family, then you start to proclaim this gospel through your very lives. And I think you're going to start to realize how radical and revolutionary that actually is. For young people who have just never seen that, who have been fed this idea of the scrunched up piece of paper, where love is just a social contract, you just use each other and then throw each other away. Christian marriages now have the potential to be this beacon in a dark world, where people are going to realize, you actually love each other. You actually listen to each other. You actually care for each other. The fact that men are able to actually live a life of chastity. We're in this strange world now where even teaching chastity almost becomes illegal, because it is seen to be such a repression of human desire that it's literally almost becoming criminal. In a lot of the laws around conversion therapy, there's a real fear that even teaching chastity is now going to be seen as some form of conversion therapy for someone. I started today talking about that quote from George Weigel, where he said that the theology of the body was like a time bomb in the heart of the church waiting to go off. My hope is that as we now come to the end of the day, you're starting to realize what that actually means. Because there is a vision here of what it means to be human, which is so radically different to what we're being fed through our culture and through the media. I'm also hoping you're starting to realize what that journey looks like. As we've recognized the war that is within the human heart. The fact that there is this battle against our brokenness and against that lust, where we are just trying to use each other and, manipulate each other. What actually does that journey of conversion look like within us? It's more than just simply believing in Jesus and singing a few nice songs. There's a radical change that has to happen within here before I can begin to love the way I'm meant to love. And so this is where we need to really cry out to the Holy Spirit to convert us, to change us. We need to delve into these scriptures and meditate upon them deeply until the word starts to shape us as human beings. And I think it's only when, as a church, we actually start to live this, at that point we can start to save the rest of the world. The problem is that as a church, I think the vast majority of people aren't interested, or they're very actively still in this act of rebellion. We don't want to know the laws. We think the church is trying to steal our joy. And so we're going to dissent, we're going to go against it. I've seen a number of times within the church that anytime a priest even starts to think about talking about contraception, it's like, no, we don't talk about that. Because you'll upset the congregation. But there's this culture in our church stealing our inheritance from us. We need to come back and realize that we've been given an opportunity to actually share in the divine. Like love is not meant to be like the animals, it's meant to be more like heaven. There's a real journey we've got to go on here as a church. So this kind of brings to a close what we presented for today. As I said, I'm very aware there's a lot we've thrown at you, and this was the brief summary version. Okay. My hope is that this has simply sparked off a real hunger in you, that you'd now go and learn. Like I said, there are a lot of very good books for sale online. There's a lot of great videos you can watch. There are a lot of speakers much better than us who are going to explain this better. But I really want to encourage you to delve into JP2's vision of what it means to be human. Because I think we're going to find there what the world is really looking for. Like we're crying out for heaven. Like the world is crying for their true homeland, but people keep selling us a cheap imitation. And it's when we start to see the real version, something in our hearts knows that. You know, as difficult as it is, we know that this journey of conversion, this journey of laying our life down is hard, but something in you awakens and you're like, I want that. That's what I'm made for. So this is what we need to proclaim to our world and to our church. Let's finish in prayer. So Lord Jesus, we just thank you for this opportunity. We pray that you would really awaken within us a desire to go deeper, a desire to learn. Lord, I even pray today that you would pour out an anointing on some people here, that they would become inspired to proclaim this truth, to become teachers of this to the world, to use their gifting and their occupations to speak this out into different areas of our church. And Lord, we pray that you would open up more avenues for this truth to be proclaimed to all who really need your word of life. Amen.